Hi everyone, thank you for joining in on our presentation, You're Too Sensitive. But before we begin with the presentation, we do want to acknowledge that the presentation was a lot shorter than expected. The additional 30 minutes were specifically accounted for the discussion that we were hoping to have. However, considering that this is pre-recorded, it is a lot shorter. However, I do want you all to utilize the different questions we posed and reflect on the different ones and engage with them as much as possible. Again, I would like to thank you all for tuning in. Hello everyone. So before we begin, this is a quick disclaimer. We will be using Google Slides closed caption feature, so please excuse any words or phrases that are not precisely what we say. So today we're going to be going over the topic, You're Too Sensitive, and we will be looking closely at the specific terminology in juxtaposition with complicity and how we can tie those ideas back with social justice and activism in order to cultivate discussions with our online and offline communities. So before we begin, we'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we aren't at the territory where UCSD is, it's still important to acknowledge our positionalities as settlers, even though we are at the comfort of our own homes. So by acknowledging that, I'm going to go ahead and read this. As UC San Diego sits on the unsettled territory and traditional homelands of the Kumeyaay people, we as members of the UC San Diego community must acknowledge the legacy of the Kumeyaay people. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor the original people of this land. Hi everyone, so my name is Isabella. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm double majoring in ethnic studies and history and minoring in educational studies, and I am one of the social justice educator interns.
Hi, my name is James King. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am an applied mathematics major with a minor in African American studies, and I'm one of the social justice educator interns.
Hello, my name is Jelena Tossing. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a clinical psych major with a minor in global health, and I am also a social justice educator intern.
Okay, so looking at the overview and the learning outcomes for this presentation, first and foremost, we'll be going over definitions. So we'll be talking about social justice and breaking it down further, along with activism. We're looking at complexity, and we'll also be looking very deeply at sensitivity amongst popular culture and in academia. We'll be taking a closer look at the labels problematic and canceled and how those can be juxtaposed to the label sensitive in this social media era. We'll also be talking about productivity and looking at the different ways that we can reclaim or take back the term sensitive and essentially reterm it and how that ties into activism itself. And we'll also have some closing remarks at the end with a resource slide. So normally if we would have a live webinar, we would ask a question and we would ask people for feedback and we'd have back and forths. But because this will be recorded beforehand, we will be discussing amongst ourselves what social justice, or what do we know about social justice. I kind of wanted to phrase this in the sense that so is far more prominent than what it was when I came into this position, especially when I was probably starting out in college. To me, social justice was kind of understanding that there was wrong in the world and there was action that could be done to counteract that in a sense. That's what I knew about social justice before I really started to get into more social justice work and social justice settings and environments to learn more and understand more.
So for me, kind of going with, or like on the topic of James and like how he's taken this question, before, I thought that social justice was something that was, or I thought that it was like things we would read to understand systems of oppression. I didn't know the work I was doing within community was social justice until people told me it was, because I was never provided the same framework that's typically used in academia. But as far as my knowledge goes, I've only taken a few courses on social justice-based classes, but other than that, I think a lot of my work is more in line with community.
When I think about what I know about social justice, um, I think it means like advocating for others as well as myself, who sit at different like intersections of oppression, um, based on these kind of imaginary social identities, but they have very real negative consequences based off of that. So it's bringing justice to those who are facing injustice in the systems and our social systems today.
Yeah, so we'll be breaking down social justice. First of all, looking at theory and next practice. So looking at social justice theory focuses very heavily on reflection of different past social movements and understanding the oppression that has come with that, along with different things that could be changed, or understanding the social changes that have come with these different movements, while action is focused around actually going about making different changes to help better those situations. So action can fall in the lines of someone leading a protest. It can also be someone educating students about the real history of their people, juxtaposed to the history that is very often taught at schools. So very often, it's very important to realize and understand the difference between theory and practice, because theory is more so about educating yourself on what is happening present and being able to hopefully change or have better understanding of what has happened and what is going on, so you can make better change later on or in the now. And that change you make now or later on will be in the form of action. Also, just to read the definition. Social justice is a concept identifying structures, so things like racism, capitalism, sexism, that produce uneven power relations and perpetuate the conditions of injustice, inequality, and inequity among various communities. And I'll also read this quote, and I will tie it into what was just discussed. But human activity consists of action and reflection. It is practice, but it is transformation of the world. And as practice, it requires theory to illuminate it. Human activity is theory and practice. It is reflection and action. So with everything that we do, it's all focused on the theory of what we want to happen, and also what we know has happened in the past, and looking at the action that can be taken to either better the situation or to reverse what has been done, or in general, to hopefully right some wrongs.
So this is an aspect, again, branching off of what James was saying. So I'm going to be talking about activism in academia and activism outside of academia, specifically looking at whether there is a disconnect, where those two intersect, and how we can encapsulate all those ideas into understanding how to dismantle systems of oppression. So when we think of activism in academia, this is typically where we see theory, more specifically theoretical frameworks, in order to understand what marginalized communities are dealing with and how they are looking to dismantle those different types of oppression. This is also where we see knowledge legitimization. And what I mean by that is this is where scholars are taking the information they've gathered, either through ethnographic work, through their research, and gathering those ideas and publishing them in order for other scholars and academics to understand the systems of oppression that marginalized communities are facing, And when we think about activism in academia, this is often where we see the disconnect. There's this perception that scholars are not connected with their communities and are extracting from their communities and are producing harm to their communities because of that disconnect. And also there's this question that should this knowledge that is being produced by these scholars be even for academia? And why is academia being used as a catalyst to legitimize knowledges that communities are producing? So when we think about activism outside of academia, this is also where we see action more typically, where we see community and grassroots work. And often there's a disconnect because of the hierarchies within academia versus outside of academia. However, there have been scholars who have interrogated both of these ideas in order to look at how both scholarship and activism can be intertwined in order to understand and reimagine futures of marginalized communities. And a really great quote that encapsulates those ideas is a pretty lengthy one, but I'm gonna go ahead and read it anyway. This is from George Lipsitz in the book Engaging Contradictions, and in this he states, Robin D.G. Kelley describes social movement activism as a kind of poetry. Progressive social movements do not simply produce statistics and narratives of oppression, he argues. The best ones do what great poetry always does: transport us to another place, compel us to imagine a new society. Scholars and activists alike need to create the kind of poetry to carry out sophisticated intellectual tasks. They both have a stake in the creation of new institutions, practices, and identities. Scholars need activism to change the spaces in which we work, to alter power relations and communities our students come from and to which they return. Activists need the perspectives, connections, and critiques that scholars can supply. And this is a really powerful quote that integrates and demonstrates that scholarship and activism are integral with one another, and they can work in collaboration with one another in order to dismantle systems of oppression. So this is another discussion question that we're going to be doing. So why do you think being sensitive has negative connotations? I don't want to repeat anything that we're going to be saying for the next few slides, so I'm just going to do another perspective. Like being sensitive is often associated with someone who's perceived as weak, so that's why I think there's negative connotations surrounding that.
Yeah, I think sensitivity so often it's connected heavily to emotions, and in general our society, because it's very because men in general have the societal power and emotions aren't connected to men, and also they're very often deemed as weak, we kind of see sensitivity or being sensitive as a bad thing. And even when we talk about sensitivity, it's so often it's discussed in this negative light because of the way our society is formed.
Yes, so I agree with both of those. What was I gonna say? Yeah, I feel like a lot of the reason why we think sensitivity is so negative comes from the messages that we get through media or through like social interactions. And these are messages that have been constantly repeated and instilled within society for generations. So I feel like it's hard to think outside of that framework when that's all we kind of know. But yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone. Now we're going to be talking about sensitivity and social justice. You might be asking why we covered social justice and activism without tying it with sensitivity. Well, this is the slide for that. We're going to be looking at the interrelatedness between both of the two terms and frameworks in order within our communities and in popular culture. Okay, so going over sensitive, there's a bunch of definitions online for sensitive, but there was just too much, so I just compiled it into a really short sentence, which I will be saying right now. So the definition of sensitive is someone who is responsive, someone who's easily affected, and or someone who feels deeply about what is going on around them. And essentially folks who are labeled as sensitive feel some sort of sentiment when something is being inflicted upon them or someone they care about or someone within what they are encountering, and something that is also being said. And then there's also this association with the gender binary, and this is where the social justice and activism part comes into perspective. But before I talk about the gender binary, I want to quickly go over the gender division of labor and why sensitivity is so associated with gender. So when we think about the gender division of labor in regards to capitalism, when we think of men, they're within the public sphere and are most often associated with being in political positions and are also folks who are contributing to society through monetary terms, whereas women are within the home and are not necessarily producing any monetary value for a society. And that's where we see the disconnect between the two, is that men are deemed more valuable because they're being able to produce for a society through monetary terms, whereas women are not. And then when we think about men also in this type of society, men are associated with being stoic and just pushing along through their daily lives within work, and are also have ideas of grit. And with grit, it's like they're holding in anything they have to in order to proceed with their day, whether that's any hardships they might be encountering or obstacles. And then when we think about womanhood, it's often associated with maternal instincts, someone who has a heightened sense of emotion, and someone who is extremely sensitive to different situations. And by acknowledging the gender division of labor, men are essentially considered more valuable in a capitalist type society because they're able to provide for a society in a way that a woman cannot. Therefore, certain values within that specific gender, primarily men, is considered more valuable, whereas other attributes such as sensitivity is not. So that's why when someone is labeled as sensitive, it's immediately a negative connotation because they aren't considered valuable to a society such as ours. And that's where we see being sensitive is someone who is deemed feminine or has feminine attributes. Okay, so these are other labels that are very similar to the term sensitive that we've compiled. The first one is politically correct. So politically correct people are extremely careful not to offend or upset any group of people in society who have disadvantaged or who have been treated differently because of their sex, race, or disability, etc., etc. Snowflakes is a political insult for someone who is perceived as too sensitive, often used for millennials and liberals. The third one is social justice warriors, or SJWs. It's used as a mocking term for one who is seen as overly progressive or left-wing. And then this is the very last one. So easily offended is just everything combined with one another. So someone who is viewed as either sensitive, politically correct, someone who is a snowflake, and or an SJW. Let's see. So by understanding all these different terminologies, there's often this association with emotions and politics, and that someone who is too emotional shouldn't be in politics, which is why sensitive is used as a term to be mobilized against folks who are interested in politics and want to call out certain injustices. And by understanding that there's a connection between these two, we must look at sensitive as a theoretical framework to understanding oppression and oppressive systems. So by understanding it as a framework, sensitivity can now be used as a way to dismantle preconceived ideas of sensitivity. And the first question is, what's wrong with being sensitive? And I think a better way to put that is, why shouldn't we be sensitive? There's often this idea, there's often times where politicians don't want to associate with emotions because they say like, oh, women are too emotional to be in political positions of power, or that people who are too emotional shouldn't be in positions of power. And this is another quote that ties into that. If our first response to offending or microaggressing someone of marginalized identity or an ally is to become defensive and point the blame back at them, that shows a lack of respect and accountability that hinders relationship building. And because there's this disassociation with being someone who is emotional, that's often the antithesis of being stoic, or someone who doesn't want to show emotion when doing work such as politics. And another way of understanding someone who is stoic is someone who's being complicit. And just because you're not necessarily showing emotions to a specific situation doesn't mean that you don't have a specific disposition towards that injustice. So by being stoic or complicit to a situation, those different types of oppressions are being replicated and are being perpetuated. And lastly, that goes back into what we mean by gender, grit, and sensitivity, and how by conflating gender and sensitivity and grit, those are ideas that are used to maintain a cis white heteropatriarchal nation state and are used as labels in order to keep reproducing those systems.
Okay, so something we definitely wanted to bring up is this sort of call-out contradiction. If someone can call someone else sensitive, then why is it not okay to be labeled as problematic? And this is more of a food for thought. So when thinking about the cycles that perpetuate these kinds of conversations or disagreements of sorts. Yeah. So we'll be moving into sort of unpacking cancel culture. I feel like this is very related to what we're talking about. And a question I want to pose to y'all is, what are your opinions on cancel culture?
I have a lot of thoughts on cancel culture. I think I took a class last year that made me think about it a lot, and how when someone is canceled, we want them to like apologize immediately for their behavior and take account for it. But then my professor was like, if you force that on the people who are doing like really problematic things, they don't necessarily feel sorry at the moment. They may still hold those ideas regardless of what the community says. But I think that's another way of thinking about it. But that's kind of a sympathetic way of thinking about people who are being canceled. But in general, I think that cancel culture is valid, and it's important to acknowledge and keep creators and influencers accountable of their different dispositions.
Okay, so I have a lot of mixed opinions on cancel culture because I think my two biggest opinions on cancel culture are, one, I feel like in a lot of ways it is somewhat necessary. It's like a little bit, at least how it at least in like an individual sense, because very often we have to do what we can to limit the type of interactions that we're having, depending on if they're negative or positive or how they affect us. So in that sense, I think it's very good as like a individual type of thing. But as a group setting, I think I don't know, one, how effective it actually is, and two, I feel like it can be a lot better than how it has actually played out. I guess the shortest way to put it.
Okay, thank y'all for sharing. I think that within these next few within these next few slides, my opinion about it will be obvious. So yeah. So starting out with what is cancel culture for folks who don't know, the process that it normally takes is in 3 steps. So what does canceling mean? It means that a celebrity or person with influence or platform is seen as irrelevant in the eyes of society and is ignored/boycotted. What is the process? So a celebrity is canceled or labeled problematic. They are then ignored by the community who agrees with them being canceled or problematic. After a while, they seem to kind of resurface after a brief hiatus, and then eventually it feels as though the cancellation is forgotten. So something we want to pose again is cancel culture even real if folks are able to kind of regain the platform that they had before? Also, a very popular opinion about cancel culture is cancel culture actually toxic? Mm-hmm. And then usually accountability measures are taken by the celebrity or influencer who has been canceled. Some of these include, oh wait, let me re-say that. What am I saying? Oh yeah, okay. So accountability measures that take place after someone is canceled, things that are done, or actions that are being taken by folks who want to cancel someone. A popular way is through using hashtags. So usually we'll see a hashtag, the name of the influencer that is canceled, and then is over party. And this is a very popular way to get momentum for a kind of like cancel movement, because it shows up on folks' social media pages when they're trending. Something that the influencer or celebrity does themselves is an apology video.
We own apology videos.
Oh my God.
I love you guys all so much.
You can see my heart drop.
Yeah. Okay, bring me the phones, everybody. Let's see what we got.
There's been a lot of critique about whether these apology videos are even real or they're just doing it to kind of get their image back. Other folks feel like they should have never made apology videos in the first place because they shouldn't be apologizing for what actions they may have done. And then lastly, another popular one is an influencer celebrity donating to charity. So this is again them trying to save their image or maybe try to remind their fans of the good person that they are. So when doing research for this section, I thought it was very important to look at the origin of the term, not only like how it actually started, but also its political origins. So when looking up, I found that it actually came from a reality show on VH1 called Love and Hip Hop in 2014, where a individual named Cisco Rosado tells Diamond Strawberry that you're canceled. So right after this episode, a lot of folks started using this term, like just like for fun, saying like, oh, I don't want to talk to you anymore, you're canceled. But eventually that evolved to having more political underlying meaning, for more, that evolved into more underlying political meanings. So something I wanted to differentiate that I didn't know until I researched this was that there's actually a difference between cancel culture, call-out culture, and outrage culture. So when we're thinking about cancel culture, it's mostly just the action of ignoring or boycotting. And I think a lot of what folks think is toxic with cancel culture actually comes from conflating it with outrage culture. So outrage is when we kind of see folks being or spreading negative comments about other folks. Technically, that's not a part of canceling someone, because when you are canceling someone, you simply just stop supporting them. But when you start attacking folks other folks who don't want to cancel them as well, then that comes from a state of outrage rather than wanting to boycott. Similarly, calling out is when, rather than boycotting them entirely, you're also trying to make them accountable, them as in the influencer celebrity. So yeah, I think it's very important to differentiate these three, because when we conflate them to being the same thing, that's when a lot of issues, I feel, come out, because it's not keeping the original intention of the word. And yeah. And then a quote I have from Charity Hubley, who is actually chair of linguistics of African America at UCSB, had this comment about canceling, and I'll just read this out loud. Canceling is a way to acknowledge that you don't have to have the power to change structural inequality. You don't even have to have the power to change all of public sentiment, but as an individual, you can still have power beyond measure. So I think this really calls to like the genuine intention of what cancel culture started off as, sort of like a way for folks to have agency over who they support. But yeah, when we conflate it with other acts such as being angry at other folks, that comes from a different culture than what was intentionally set as. Because a lot of, or as we know, a lot of movements, especially like civil rights era, involved a lot of boycotting. And I think that's the roots that canceling comes from. So then I think now too, when we were talking about other labels similar to sensitive, when folks want to say that cancel culture is toxic, they're kind of attacking the same, how do I say this? The same, they're calling cancel culture toxic to feed off of the same ways that they ridicule someone for being too sensitive, for being easily offended, for being a social justice warrior. And in that, I think it's more problematic to call cancel culture toxic, because it's like you're infringing on someone's right to choose who or not they want to support, and their own agency over who they want to continue following. And so, oh yeah, I already said supporting. Yeah.
Okay, so we also wanted to touch on offensive comedy, because on the topic of sensitivity, or this idea of sensitivity, very often offensive comedy comes into question. So there's a few things I wanted to discuss. So first off, very often when we're looking at offensive comedy, or the groups that are the people who are displaying or are talking about offensive comedy, one idea or thing I always wonder is, why is there a desire to make fun of other groups? And very often that can be, if not necessarily for alienation, it can also be to bring power to yourself, because very often if you are yourself in a bad situation, it's easier to deal with that when you know that there's someone who is quote unquote lower than you in society. I also want to talk about the importance of identity when discussing offensive comedy, because very often, okay, so how do I put this? For someone who's actually within a community to have offensive comedy about that community, that's a very different relationship than someone who's outside of the community. So me being someone Black in America, if I were to make jokes about the Black community, that's a very different relationship, and that would be something that needs to be addressed within the Black community, between me and the Black community, if it needs to be addressed at all, compared to someone who is not a part of that community making jokes. So it's very often about understanding the juxtaposition between the person who's actually delivering the joke and the communities that they come from, but also what part of your identity is impacted. And I put this here because I think very often when talking about offensive comedy, one counter argument could be that someone else who is a part of a community has also been offended by the comedy, or could be offended by the comedy, is not offended. And even though I do think this could, I want to say it could be a valid argument, but very often it doesn't even necessarily apply, because the offensive comedy could be towards people who are clumsy, and this person identifies as clumsy, compared to a situation where the comedy is about someone who's from the queer community and this person identifies as queer. So very often it's very different, has a very different impact. And also the ability to laugh at yourself. So I personally have always tried to, if I can, make light of the situation that I myself am in, or a predicament that I'm in, or different problems I have to face, it actually helps me in the long run to address it, because now I'm not stressing about it. I'm able to laugh it off. My body relaxes and I can think clearly. And I do think it's a very healthy mechanism to be able to laugh in certain situations that you're in. But forcing that onto someone can be very problematic, because very often we don't know if they are ready to face that themselves. But also, you are basically displaying to them flaws that society has deemed as flaws for them. In reality, they're not actually flaws. They may not even necessarily, there's not necessarily anything wrong with them. These are just different things that you're pointing at that society has deemed as either incorrect or ugly or invalid, which in itself doesn't do any good. So not only are you displaying this form of comedy that is addressing these issues about people that aren't necessarily issues, but you're making them face this outside of their own terms. And even if they were prepared mentally to tackle these different things or the societal problems that they have been perceived to have, that's not by any means someone else's job to make them do that. Okay, so another question we can talk about: how can we initiate and have productive conversations on isms and other structural oppressions? So I guess I'll go first. So, I mean, if we're juxtaposing this to the topic of sensitivity, I think I think the biggest thing is having an understanding of what sensitivity is implying. Because if we just hear the word sensitive and our first immediate reaction is to think, okay, this is something that's bad, or something, not able to have any type of progressive discussion on these different isms or cultural oppressions, because we're too worried about being seen as sensitive, when in reality sensitivity has a lot to do with history and all that. So that would be my answer.
I think for me, this is still something that is very hard for me. And I'm still in a very like trial and error kind of model when I'm having these conversations with people in my community. I think the reason why I do keep having them though is because, shoot, what was I gonna say? Oh, so I think what's important in order to have like even initiate these is to remember why it's important to you, or like to you, I mean myself. Because I think that when your heart is kind of in the right place, then it's easier to initiate and have productive conversations, because you know you're doing the best that you can. And also, like, cycles aren't going to break if no one initiates anything. So I feel like there is a responsibility for me, I feel a responsibility knowing these things. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine, but at least I tried. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm kind of on the same boat as you. I'm still learning how to work around this and have productive conversations, because while it's easy to probably initiate those conversations with friends, it's easy for them to also call you sensitive back, which I think is like really hard, because at times I don't know how to respond to that. And I think that's why I decided to do this topic, to find ways to look how we can use the term to sort of counteract the term sensitive and have more productive conversations. But yeah, I believe that I'm also doing the best I can do in regards to mentioning or even like having a brief discussion on it. And yeah, if it doesn't work out, then that's okay.
Actually, I wanted to add really quick. It's actually because of what you two had said. What was I gonna say? Okay, so it's really kind of funny, because even though we can like talk about this during a program and all that, like in the moment, sometimes it's like you forget everything. On to it, which is valid and fine. I just wanted to add that because I was like, oh yeah, it's definitely happened to me a lot.
Wait, yeah, I want to add something too. It's kind of like podcast now. Yeah, so adding on to that, I feel like with all conversations, there needs to be a mutual respect that the conversation is built on. So like for some folks, if they respect me as a person, then I feel like they have to respect my opinions and views on something. But if it's someone that like from the get-go, they don't want to hear what I have to say, then I kind of save myself for folks who will listen, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
And same, I had a similar situation happen to me. There was a time when I had a friend who I wanted to have this type of conversation with, and I've tried multiple times. And this is when I reached out to one of the SJEs when I wasn't an SJE before. I asked them like what I should do in this moment in time, and they basically told me like, same, like if they don't respect what you have to say, like they're just being anti-Black, and that's what it is. And if they're not willing to learn, they're not willing to learn. But I think, yeah, it's important also to bring it up. Yeah, agree with that. Respect.
Okay, so responding to sensitive callouts, or how you should deal with a situation when someone is calling you sensitive. And as we had said, this can be really hard to do, especially in the moment, because even though we're talking about these things now, in that moment when someone says that you're being sensitive about this or you need to stop, it can be really, really hard to mentally understand how to navigate, one, the word that they're using, how they're using it, the form that they're using it in, the different power dynamics within that word, and so on and so forth. So we'll each one way in general that you can go about understanding the use of the word sensitive. So, or even a way that you can, something that you can talk about. So one, there is no accurate way to depict emotional trauma or pain. So if I were to have a paper cut and I were to show that to someone, then they would have a genuine understanding of the level of pain I'm feeling. Even though we all feel physical pain differently, they would still have a genuine idea of that. And that can be said for all types of physical injuries, but when it comes to emotional or mental pain, based on, say, someone's words or actions, there's not really a good way to depict that. So for someone calling you sensitive because you were offended by this, or this is offensive to your identity or part of your culture or anything like that, they, one, don't have an understanding of your emotional pain or trauma that can come with that, but also they may not even know the historical trauma that follows up with that. Even if they know the history behind it, they won't really be able to understand the actual level or amount of emotional trauma that comes with that. Same way, if I talk about different things about how slavery has impacted Black people up until this point, even though I can explain that very well, people still might not get that emotional trauma that comes with it. Or if we talk about different border issues or things of that nature, there's no way to effectively 100% and completely communicate that level of emotional pain.
So another thing to also important when you're stepping in is that it's not entirely a responsibility for people to understand, but it's still important to step in when we encounter blatant attacks on marginalized communities. And I think another way that is not, another way is to like also constantly unlearn, but keep learning about these types of injustices and bringing it back to your community within different types of conversations by making certain vocab that's being presented in academia more feasible for folks within our communities. And I found that by looking up different wordings for the different frameworks, I've been able to sort of help some friends and my friends understand some of the things that they are saying that's completely problematic. So yeah, But it's also, again, not our responsibility to constantly educate people, but it's so important to acknowledge where we are in terms of our knowledge. And yeah.
Yes. So when we do, or sorry, when I do find myself stepping into conversations, I think I found it very beneficial to kind of challenge the idea and not the person, because the ideas are like a reflection of generations of negative messages. It's not entirely their idea per se. And then I kind of think about remembering how you started your own journey. So by you, I mean I think about the kinds of conversations people gave to me, or like the random privilege I had to get access to these conversations. Does that make sense? So yeah, re-emphasizing what Isabella said about how it's important to bring back what we learn in academia and make it easier for folks in our communities to understand. Thinking about the person I was when I first started learning about these things and the people who gave that knowledge to me. Yeah.
Okay, so just to break it down a little further. So there's more or less 3 big steps in taking back this term sensitive or being able to reterm it, or at least change the understanding of it. First is understanding the structural oppressions and the different isms that play into the way we view the word sensitive, but also how the word sensitive is used in those different structures. Next is dismantling the gender disposition of the term sensitive, because of what has already been discussed, how sensitivity is so connected to someone's gender identity, or not even really someone's gender identity, the way their gender identity is perceived in our society. And then lastly is reclaiming the term sensitivity to enforce change. So making sure that it's well known and understood that sensitivity really, it goes back to this idea of the different struggle or trauma that can be connected to whatever is being discussed, or wherever someone is claiming they're being sensitive about.
So we talked a lot about how to handle being in these kinds of situations, but I think it's very important to remind ourselves to respect our own emotional, what the heck, but I think it's very important for us to also remember to respect our own emotional capacity when dealing with these kinds of conversations. As I said earlier, like the ideas that we're trying to challenge, they've taken like literal like generations, hundreds of years to instill. So the fact that you've already done it for yourself is saying a lot. And I think that's something to be proud of. So when you feel like it's hard to talk to others, giving yourself grace and slack in that situation is doing a lot already. So we've talked a lot, and I think now we're going to go ahead and tie everything that we talked about back to activism. So this is a pyramid, popularly known as the pyramid of hate, and it kind of illustrates how seemingly surface level things are actually the foundation for bigger and more serious issues, because it creates a culture where it's okay for these more serious things to happen. So I'm just going to break this down really quick. When we look at the very bottom layer, it's called prejudiced attitudes. So these are the things that we're talking about. Oh no, it's not. Shoot. Okay, reverse. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and unpack this pyramid. When we look at the very foundational level, it's prejudiced attitudes. So these are, when I'm referring to the ideas, I was saying that took generations to instill. Those are the things that kind of live in our head and the messages we get from a patriarchal, racist, homophobic, capitalist society. And those messages kind of live in our thoughts, and they form these prejudiced attitudes. And that leads to acts of prejudice that come from our attitude. So this is what I'm talking about, or what we were talking about when there's like offensive comedy, when someone calls you too sensitive after you call them out for doing like things such as name calling, ridiculing others, telling belittling jokes. And it seems like it's really not that serious, but because we have this kind of environment where we can have these acts of prejudice, it makes it okay to go up to discrimination. So again, these might not always seem like overt when it comes to issues of employment, housing, and educational discrimination, harassment, things of that nature. But it does when it switches over to violence. And then later when our violence supports genocide. And it seems like these our jokes don't really feed into that but when you see it in this little pyramid and break it down, it actually makes a lot of sense. I think about how there is genocide happening right now when we look at the disproportionate deaths in America due to COVID-19 and which groups are dying at faster rates. And then when we go back to the ideas that we're getting from our patriarchal, racist, homophobic, capitalist society that tell us that there is a disposable group in our society, that's what leads to genocide. Yeah.
So this is a concluding quote about literally everything that we discussed. And this is from is it Everyday Feminism website? And it says, "I may be tender, but oppression is also cold, harsh, traumatizing, painful, unaccountable, ruthless, and ancestral." And by gathering everything that we've discussed, sensitivity is inherently political, emotions are inherently political, and it's important to understand how we can take back the term sensitive in order to mobilize ourselves in situations where these systems of oppressions are being perpetuated. So before we end the presentation, I want to leave you all with several questions to think about. So why are we not allowed to feel about situations that are harmful to us? Why can't we be sensitive? Why are we not allowed to have these types of conversations? What is the point in protecting binaries and oppressions produced by a cis white heteropatriarchal nation state? And why do we value complicity over sensitivity? So with that, these are the following resources that can provide you all with more in-depth knowledge about what we've been discussing. We'll probably leave some more in the description if we find any more, but yeah, use this for your own purposes. Thank you all for joining in our presentation.